There's a particular way some people experience life, not quite present, not quite absent, like watching through glass. You're in a conversation and you're tracking what you're saying while you're saying it. Monitoring your tone, calibrating your words. Not because you're anxious, though others might read it that way, but because there's a part of you that's always slightly removed, observing the interaction as it unfolds. You're both participant and audience, both actor and critic. Or you're in an emotional moment, grief, joy, anger, and even as the feeling moves through you, there's this other awareness. A witness, watching you feel, analyzing the texture of the emotion, noting its progression. The feeling is real, but you're experiencing it from inches away, as though your consciousness has learned to stand just outside itself. This isn't overthinking. This is something deeper, a fundamental orientation of your awareness, a perpetual sense of being audience to your own existence. The common explanation is that you're detached, cold, living in your head, that you need to be more present or stop analyzing everything. But this misses what's actually happening. This isn't a failure of engagement. This is an energetic movement of consciousness itself, a pattern Carl Jung recognized as one of the psyche's primary modes of organizing experience. Jung saw this not as pathology but as architecture, a way the mind naturally creates distance to serve a particular function. He called it the introverted attitude, the withdrawal of psychic energy from the external object back toward the internal subject. Not shyness, not social awkwardness, but a fundamental redirection of life force itself. You're not failing to engage with the world. You're engaging through a different lens entirely, one that turns outward experience into inward meaning before it can be fully lived. This watching consciousness has a name in Jung's framework. It appears as a sub-archetype of what he called the sage or wise old man, the observer, the one who sees, who understands, who processes reality through perception rather than direct immersion. And when this function operates consciously, it becomes a profound gift, the capacity for psychological objectivity, for tracking patterns others miss, for holding complexity without collapsing into it. But when it operates unconsciously, when the distance becomes defense rather than insight, it carries a price most people never name. Here's what we're going to explore: the hidden architecture of this watching consciousness, why some minds naturally create this distance, what Jung discovered about the energetic movement that generates it, the archetypal dimension where observation becomes a genuine psychological function, and most importantly, what this pattern costs when it turns from sacred witnessing into defensive surveillance, what gets lost when the balcony becomes a prison rather than a vantage point. Because the observer archetype is real. The gift of deep seeing is genuine. But there's a difference between consciousness that watches to understand and consciousness that watches to avoid being touched. And that difference changes everything. Jung's definition of introversion has nothing to do with shyness, nothing to do with social anxiety or preference for solitude. It's not behavioral, it's energetic. He wrote that introversion means a turning inwards of libido. That psychic energy, the life force that animates consciousness, doesn't move toward the external object, but withdraws from it into the subject. This isn't a choice you make. It's a fundamental direction your energy naturally flows. Away from the world, toward the inner realm. Jung called this the abstracting attitude. And here's what he observed. The introvert is always facing the same question. Unconsciously, perpetually, how can libido be withdrawn from the object? Not, should I engage with this, but how do I pull my energy back from it? Reality doesn't get met directly. It gets translated, filtered, processed through subjective frameworks before it can register as experience. You feel this as distance, as that observational gap between you and what's happening. But Jung saw it as a survival strategy, what he called individual equipment with manifold means of self-protection. The introvert, he wrote, conserves himself from any expenditure of energy directly related to the object, thus consolidating for himself the most secure and impregnable position. This is conservation. Energy management. The psyche protecting its resources by creating fortifications between itself and the world's demands. Two cognitive functions particularly generate this watching stance, and understanding them reveals how the mind constructs the observer position at a structural level. The first is introverted thinking. Jung described it as being primarily orientated by the subjective factor. It starts in you, returns to you, even when it's analyzing external reality. What this means experientially, you don't encounter facts directly. You encounter them through your frameworks, your internal models, your analytical lenses. Reality passes through these structures rather than being met on its own terms. Jung noted that everything about the introverted thinker tends to disappear and get concealed. Their judgment appears cold, inflexible, arbitrary, because it relates far less to the object than to the subject. This is the mechanism. Inner logical consistency becomes more important than external relatedness. The thinker builds elaborate cognitive fortifications, systems of thought, conceptual frameworks, and watches reality from behind them. Safe, contained, interpretive rather than participatory. The second function is introverted intuition. Where introverted thinking analyzes through subjective frameworks, introverted intuition perceives symbolically. These individuals don't see what's in front of them. They see what it means, the patterns beneath, the archetypal forces moving through ordinary events. Jung described this as perception via the unconscious. Not external possibilities, but what the external object has released within. The introverted intuitive experiences an extraordinary aloofness from tangible reality and can become a complete enigma to his own immediate circle. He doesn't see the stumbling block before his feet, Jung wrote, but smells a rat 10 miles away. For these individuals, life becomes symbolic representation. They're watching the deeper drama, the mythic substrate beneath surface reality, present to meaning, absent from the concrete moment. This is design, not malfunction. Jung recognized that humans possess what he called the reflective instinct, one of 5 fundamental drives, alongside hunger, sexuality, activity, and creativity, the need to step back, to observe, to transform raw experience into meaning through the act of witnessing it. The observer consciousness emerges from this instinct when it combines with introverted energy flow and these particular cognitive functions. It's an evolutionary adaptation, relatively insignificant fertility, Jung noted, but manifold means of self-protection. The mind that watches conserves what the mind that participates expends. But here's the crucial distinction. This withdrawal serves consciousness development when it's chosen. When the distance creates space for reflection, for symbolic understanding, for dialogue with the psyche's deeper dimensions, it becomes pathological when it's compulsive, when withdrawal becomes defense, when you're not creating reflective space, but building protective obstacles against the world's overwhelming claims. The energetic movement and cognitive architecture create the mechanism, but Jung discovered this pattern has an archetypal foundation that transforms observation from mere psychological quirk into genuine psychological function. The observer doesn't exist in isolation. It's a sub-archetype, a specific expression of one of Jung's oldest psychological figures, the sage, the wise old man, the one who knows. Jung mapped 3 functions this archetype serves. First, seeing. Possessing intuitive knowledge unobstructed by ego conditioning, the capacity to perceive what others miss, not through analysis but through direct psychological vision. Second, understanding, inducing self-reflection, mobilizing moral forces, making conscious what was previously hidden. Third, advising, offering guidance while leaving ultimate responsibility with the individual. C, understand, advise, but notice what's missing. Act. The sage observes, interprets, illuminates, but doesn't descend into the arena. This is the archetypal template the observer inherits: wisdom purchased through distance, insight gained by remaining outside the action. And when this pattern operates consciously, when the withdrawal serves genuine understanding rather than defensive retreat, it becomes a profound psychological function. Jung experienced this directly through his relationship with Philemon, an inner figure with kingfisher wings and bull's horns who appeared during his years of confronting the unconscious. Philemon taught him what Jung called the actuality of the soul, that psychic reality possesses its own objective existence, that inner figures aren't projections but autonomous presences with their own intelligence, their own agency. Jung would walk in his garden, conversing with Philemon as he would any external person. The figure would challenge him, respond unpredictably, offer wisdom Jung's conscious mind hadn't formulated. This is sacred witnessing, the observer function at its highest expression, not watching from fear but from openness, not analyzing to control but perceiving to understand, allowing what's observed its full autonomy. Jung developed a method for this: active imagination, a dialectical procedure between conscious ego and unconscious perspective, not passive fantasy, genuine dialogue. He made it a rule. His biographer Barbara Hanna noted, never to let a figure or figures that he encountered leave until they had told him why they had appeared to him. Both sides speak, both sides listen. The ego doesn't collapse into the unconscious, and the unconscious isn't dismissed as mere projection. This is witnessing that serves consciousness, that deepens understanding, that creates space for psychic contents to reveal themselves rather than forcing them into predetermined frameworks. But there's another kind of watching, and the difference is everything. Voyeurism, defensive surveillance. The observer who watches not to understand, but to avoid being vulnerable, who derives gratification, as the psychological literature notes, from the power inherent in the observer's hidden status, maintaining cynical detachment, violating consent through secret observation, not dialogue but extraction. Jung recognized this as the shadow side of the sage archetype, what he called the detached manipulator. The one who withholds knowledge for control, who possesses cynical detachment from life and human values, who watches to maintain superiority rather than to serve truth. The sacred witness opens. The voyeur conceals. The sacred witness allows autonomy. The voyeur consumes. The sacred witness serves consciousness development. The voyeur serves anxiety and the need for control. Same observational capacity, opposite intentions, and the psyche knows the difference, even when the ego doesn't. Jung understood that integration of the wise old man represents the final stage of individuation, emerging only after serious wrestling with shadow and anima. The archetypal sequence unfolds: shadow, then anima or animus, then the mana figure of the sage, culminating in the self itself. You don't start as the sage, you earn it through descent, through confronting what you've rejected, through relationship with the unconscious that transforms rather than interprets. But for those identified with the observer pattern, there's a dangerous shortcut: believing you've already arrived. That watching from the balcony makes you wise. That distance equals objectivity. That analyzing life is the same as understanding it. What most people never see is how this archetypal function operates beneath the social surface, concealed behind a carefully constructed mask. Jung called the persona a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a mask designed to make specific impressions on others while concealing who you actually are beneath it. For the observer, this mask has a particular shape. Externally, you appear quiet, non-intrusive, emotionally controlled, self-sufficient, analytical, content-focused. As the Enneagram tradition notes, you're wordy but not big on small talk. You can discuss ideas for hours but struggle with the social choreography of casual connection. The persona serves three functions: protection from what feels like excessive emotional demands, conservation of energy you experience as limited, and concealment of vulnerability you've learned isn't safe to reveal. It allows you to participate in collective life, to be present in rooms, in relationships, in work, while maintaining psychological distance. And it works. You navigate social worlds. You contribute insight when called upon. You fulfill your roles. From the outside, you appear functional, maybe even successful, but there's a profound misattunement between what others perceive and what you're actually experiencing. Others see emotionally disconnected, aloof, over-analytical, possibly arrogant, difficult to read. Someone who processes everything through their head. Someone who seems content to remain on the periphery. Someone who doesn't seem to need what others need: warmth, validation, emotional intimacy. The internal reality, a rich fantasy life with extraordinary complexity, intense observation, what the research calls extraordinary perceptiveness and insight that never stops running. Deep sensitivity to emotional undercurrents others don't even notice. And passionate engagement with ideas, with meaning, with understanding that feels more real than most conversations you're expected to have. You're not cold. You're protecting something intensely alive from a world that feels too loud, too demanding, too invasive. The quiet mask shields a self that would be overwhelmed if fully exposed. This is the gap between how you're seen and how you feel, between the flat exterior and the vivid interior. And over time, this gap becomes so normalized you forget it exists. The mask becomes mistaken for the face. Observers naturally position themselves at culture's edge, not fully outside, that would be isolation, but not immersed either. Standing at the boundary between participation and interpretation, you can see patterns those absorbed in the action cannot. Track how power moves through systems. Notice the unstated rules governing social dynamics. You're the cultural interpreter, translating what's happening for those too close to perceive it clearly. This position offers real gifts: perceptive distance, symbolic literacy, the capacity to name what others sense but can't articulate. When conscious, this becomes service, insight that illuminates for the collective, but there's a price. And it's paid in a currency most people never count: the texture of genuine encounter, the risk of being known not conceptually but intimately, the vulnerability of stepping from interpreter into participant. Because standing at the edge, watching, analyzing, understanding, protects you from the one thing the observer pattern most deeply fears: being consumed by demands you don't have resources to meet. And that fear has a name: a shadow structure operating entirely beneath conscious awareness, one that determines not just how you relate, but what you're unconsciously hoarding. The Enneagram tradition has a precise term for what the observer hoards: avarice. But not for money, not for possessions, for something more fundamental. You're hoarding time, space, energy, knowledge, and most critically, yourself. This manifests in behaviors so normalized you don't recognize them as withholding, limiting output while limiting intrusion, keeping conversations short to conserve energy, holding back insights because sharing them feels like expenditure, rationing emotional availability, creating elaborate systems to minimize demands on your resources, physical, psychological, relational. The underlying belief: I must protect myself from a world that demands too much and gives too little. There's a felt sense of scarcity at the core of the observer pattern. the belief that you don't have enough, that if you give what's asked, you'll be left depleted, empty, with nothing for yourself. So you contract, you limit, you control the flow of what moves out from you into the world. The mechanism is intellectualization, and it's more sophisticated than most people realize. Joseph Burgo describes it as a massive and ongoing effort to divert attention away from the bodily places where we notice our feelings and into the emotion-free zone of the intellect. You're not avoiding feelings because you don't have them. You're transforming them into thoughts because the feelings are too overwhelming to experience directly. Grief becomes analysis of loss. Anger becomes philosophical exploration of injustice. Longing becomes theoretical investigation of attachment. The emotion is real, but by the time it reaches consciousness, it's been translated, processed, contained within cognitive frameworks that make it manageable. Donald Winnicott observed that erratic childhood care can lead to overdependence on intellectuality as a substitute for mothering. The mind learns to mother itself, to provide the emotional regulation that wasn't reliably available externally. And that strategy works until it becomes automatic. Until you can't access the feeling without first translating it into understanding. The emotions get locked, as the research notes, behind a defensive wall of armoring which prevents closeness with themselves and others. True intimacy and conflict. Not because you're incapable of feeling, but because feeling without the protective layer of analysis threatens to overwhelm the entire system. Jung understood this as an imbalance between two fundamental psychological principles: eros, relatedness, emotional connection, dissolution of boundaries; logos, discrimination, analysis, detachment. He wrote that eros dissolves divisions to reveal underlying unity, while logos structures reality through analysis. The observer overdevelops logos, and eros, the capacity for genuine emotional connection, for allowing boundaries to soften, for experiencing life through relationship rather than observation, remains unconscious, undeveloped, sometimes feared. Jung was clear. Harmonization of eros and logos is essential to individuation. The imbalance doesn't just create relational difficulty, it fragments the psyche. You become split between the part that thinks and the part that feels, between the observer and the experiencer. And over time, you begin to believe the observer is you, that consciousness itself is fundamentally analytical rather than participatory. This creates what contemporary consciousness research calls hyper-reflexivity, not healthy self-awareness, but pathological self-monitoring. You're watching yourself watch, analyzing your analysis. The recursive loop tightens until spontaneity becomes nearly impossible. Neuroscience reveals the mechanism, the default mode network, regions responsible for self-referential processing, shows overactivity in depression and social anxiety. The brain that can't stop thinking about itself, that can't release into direct experience, becomes trapped in what meditation literature calls the observer trap, creating a new ego position, the meditator, the aware one, that maintains the very separation it's trying to transcend. What gets lost in this recursive watching? Direct embodied experience, unreflective presence, the capacity to act without first analyzing the action, genuine relational encounter where you're meeting someone rather than studying them, the vitality of being touched by life rather than interpreting it from behind protective glass. But the deepest cost reveals itself not in solitude, but in the structure of relationship itself, where the mechanisms of psychic avarice and intellectualization create a relational stance that's both perceptive and profoundly isolating. You excel at seeing patterns in relationships, tracking motives, noticing repeating scripts before others recognize they're caught in them. You can read a room's emotional dynamics with precision most people never develop. You know who holds power, who's performing, Who's actually present and who's merely going through motions? Leadership theorists Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky describe this as the balcony perspective, the strategic vantage point where you gain clarity, see patterns, understand the broader context. From the balcony, you watch the dance floor below. You track how people move, how their attention to one another shifts, the underlying choreography invisible to those caught in the movement. And you're exceptional at this, the observer's natural position. But Heifetz identifies the critical element most people miss, the staircase, the capacity to move freely between balcony and dance floor to gain perspective, then return to participation. To understand the pattern, then risk being in it rather than merely analyzing it from safety. Because here's what he observes. If you want to affect what is happening, you must return to the dance floor. Staying on the balcony in a safe observer role is as much a prescription for ineffectuality as never achieving that perspective in the first place. Observation without participation becomes paralysis. Understanding without engagement becomes isolation. The psychoanalytic literature has a precise term for how observers manage relationship: the schizoid compromise, keeping others around but preventing them from getting too close, maintaining connection while ensuring it remains on your terms, intellectual, bounded, controllable. Contact stays conceptual. You're physically present but emotionally absent. You can discuss ideas, share insights, analyze dynamics together. But when the conversation moves toward genuine intimacy, toward being seen rather than understood, toward vulnerability rather than exchange of information, you withdraw. Not dramatically, just enough to re-establish distance, just enough to return to the balcony. What the other person experiences, being analyzed rather than met, a felt sense of talking to you rather than with you, confusion about whether you're actually interested or just studying them, the subtle but undeniable recognition that something's being withheld, that you're there but not fully, present but protected. Psychoanalyst Harry Guntrip called this the in and out program, the oscillation between hunger for closeness and terror of it. You move toward connection when the loneliness becomes unbearable. You retreat when the intimacy threatens to penetrate the defenses. In, out, never quite settling into sustained, unprotected presence. The price, being known conceptually, but never intimately. Others know what you think. They don't know what you feel, because you've become so skilled at translating feeling into thought that even you've lost access to the raw experience beneath the analysis. And there's a particular loneliness to this. Not the loneliness of isolation. You may have relationships, friendships, partnerships, but the loneliness of the perpetual analyst. Of being the one who understands everyone else while remaining fundamentally unknown yourself. The balcony offers gifts. Real ones, perceptive distance, pattern recognition, the capacity to see clearly what others can't. But when it becomes your only position, when the staircase disappears, when you forget how to descend into the messiness of genuine encounter, it transforms from vantage point into exile. And that exile is held in place by something most observers never consciously examine. The belief that descending would be catastrophic, that participation would consume you, that you don't have what it takes to survive on the dance floor. We've mapped the full architecture now, the energetic withdrawal, the cognitive functions creating distance, the archetypal pattern of the sage, the persona concealing intensity, the shadow of psychic avarice, the relational cost of permanent observation. But understanding the pattern is only the beginning. Integration requires something different entirely. The paradox, for those already identified with observation, the therapeutic task isn't to develop more witnessing capacity. It's to unite witnessing with embodied action, to marry the perceptive distance you've mastered with the vulnerable participation you've avoided. Integration doesn't mean abandoning the observer function. It means learning to hold both, the capacity to see clearly, and the willingness to be touched by what you're seeing. This begins with a recognition most observers resist. The gift is real. The capacity for deep seeing, for psychological objectivity, for tracking patterns others miss. These aren't compensations for some deeper inadequacy. They're genuine functions that serve individuation when held consciously. Jung understood this. The reflective capacity isn't pathology. It's one of the psyche's primary modes of meaning-making. So the first movement, honor what you do well. Not as defense, but as actual capacity. You can perceive what others can't. That matters. That serves. The second movement, own the defensive distance. And this is harder, because it requires acknowledging what the psychoanalysts call the schizoid compromise, that you're not just naturally contemplative but actively withdrawing, that the watching serves protection as much as understanding, that there's a split between what you show and what you feel, between your vital, vulnerable self and the controlled social presentation you've learned to offer instead. Guntrip's in and out program, the oscillation between need for closeness and terror of it, operates beneath conscious awareness for most observers. You don't recognize you're doing it. You just notice that relationships somehow never quite stabilize into sustained intimacy, that people seem to want more than you can give, that you feel suffocated by what others call connection. Owning this means naming it, not as moral failure, but as psychological structure. I withdraw when intimacy threatens my defenses. I keep contact intellectual to avoid emotional exposure. I analyze people to maintain the upper hand. Just naming it breaks the automaticity. The third movement, and this is where integration actually begins, is reconnecting cognition with affect. Not thinking about feelings, but feeling them directly in the body. Contemporary trauma therapy has mapped this precisely. Diana Fosha's work in accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy emphasizes that, for many patients, being emotional means being weak or out of control. So naming and acknowledging affect within relational safety becomes the path through. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing takes it further. The intervention isn't talking about trauma or emotion, but directing the client's attention to internal sensations, both visceral and musculoskeletal. Not, what do you think about your anger, but where do you feel it in your body? This is bottom-up processing, bypassing the cognitive defenses that immediately translate feeling into thought, developing what the research calls interoceptive awareness, the capacity to perceive internal bodily states directly, learning to recognize the tightness in your chest as anxiety before your mind has labeled it, the warmth in your belly as longing before you've analyzed whether it's safe to want. Movement-based practices serve this uniquely for observers. Authentic movement, a practice rooted in Jungian active imagination, teaches practitioners to welcome and withstand transpersonal states in embodied experience, not interpreting the movement, being the movement. Defense mechanisms, the literature notes, are revealed for what they are at the somatic level and often dismantled through this integration of moving and witnessing. Tai Chi, Qigong, practices that unite observation with action, that let you feel life force moving through your body rather than conceptualizing it from the balcony. That teach the paradoxical skill of witnessing without creating new observer ego. But integration requires more than individual practice. It requires what psychoanalyst Richard Erskine calls sufficient safety, a containing, holding environment that is both non-wounding and unobtrusive. For the defended observer, therapeutic work paradoxically begins with supported withdrawal, permission to maintain distance while slowly, incrementally, testing what happens when the defenses soften, not forcing participation, creating conditions where participation becomes possible. This work doesn't happen linearly. Jung recognized that psychological development moves through distinct stages, patterns that mature through encounter rather than arriving fully formed. The transformation from defensive observer to genuine sage doesn't happen suddenly. Jung understood psychological development as a process of ripening, archetypal patterns maturing through encounter with life's demands. For the observer, this unfolds in three distinct stages. Stage 1. The curious apprentice. This is where most observers remain. Knowledge serves status. Understanding provides protection. You're driven by the need to know more, to see more clearly, to accumulate insight that distinguishes you from those who don't perceive what you perceive. The shadow risk here is what Jungian analyst Robert Moore identified: the manipulator who hides behind knowledge, the trickster who uses insight for control rather than service. You know things about people they don't know about themselves, and that knowledge creates power. Distance creates advantage. The watching position becomes leverage. You're still externally driven, seeking recognition through intellectual prowess, using observation as armor against vulnerability. The archetypal sage function is present but undeveloped, operating in service of ego protection rather than genuine wisdom. And there's a particular trap at this stage: type identification. The belief that I am the observer, as though it's identity rather than function. Jung explicitly warned against this. He wrote that having a type is problematic, that declaring yourself a type means identifying with a few 100 million other people rather than your actual individual nature. Typology describes conscious orientation, not total being. When you identify with being the observer, you rationalize defensive distance. You confuse spiritual non-attachment with psychological need to withdraw from emotions. You mistake watching for wisdom, and you remain locked in the apprentice stage, collecting knowledge instead of being transformed by it. Stage 2. The alchemist. This is where knowledge becomes embodied, no longer abstract but integrated through lived experience, and, critically, through suffering. The comfortable position on the balcony becomes untenable, not because someone forces you down, but because the loneliness, the isolation, the relentless self-monitoring finally exceeds what you can bear. You descend, not gracefully. You risk being seen, being wrong, being overwhelmed by what you've spent years analyzing from safety, and the descent breaks something open. What was conceptual becomes visceral. What you understood theoretically, you now know through your body, through relationship, through the painful work of allowing yourself to be touched by what you've only observed. This is Jung's fires of transformation, the alchemical process where lead becomes gold, not through intellectual understanding, but through the heat of actual engagement. Where the observer who thought knowledge was enough discovers that wisdom requires participation. Stage 3. The mature sage. Here, the watching function remains, the perceptive capacity doesn't disappear, but it's no longer used for protection. You can see patterns, track dynamics, offer insight, but you do it from within relationship rather than from outside it. You've become what the research calls living portals of guidance, carrying wisdom as presence rather than as accumulated information. The mature sage no longer needs to prove knowledge or protect it. The psychic avarice dissolves because you've discovered through direct experience that participation doesn't deplete, it generates. That being touched by life, risking vulnerability, allowing yourself to be changed by encounter doesn't destroy the self, but individuates it. You can move freely now, balcony, to dance floor and back, observing when perception serves, participating when presence is called for. The staircase is no longer missing. You've learned to navigate it. But this stage can't be rushed, can't be achieved through intellectual understanding alone. The mature sage emerges only after the alchemist has endured descent, and the descent requires facing what the apprentice most fears: that you might not survive engagement, that participation might consume you. Jung called what enables this transformation the transcendent function, a fifth function that doesn't replace the others but unites opposites. For observers, this means developing capacity for both careful observation and engaged participation, moving beyond type identification toward ongoing individuation. No longer exercising preference but allowing the psyche's fuller potential to emerge. And that emergence requires practice, specific, embodied work that bridges understanding and transformation. Integration requires practice, not conceptual understanding but actual embodied work that reunites what's been split. Here's what that looks like. Physical engagement. Martial arts, particularly Tai Chi, bridge observation with action in a way uniquely suited to the observer pattern. You're tracking movement, perceiving energy flow, maintaining awareness, but you're in it. Feeling life force move through your body rather than conceptualizing it from distance. The practice doesn't abandon the witnessing function. It unites witnessing with kinesthetic presence. This develops what the research calls proprioceptive and kinesthetic awareness, the capacity to feel your body in space, to perceive internal movement, to sense energy that's been trapped in your head descending into your limbs, your core, your actual lived presence. Not thinking about embodiment, being embodied while remaining aware. Emotional integration practice. This is simpler than most observers expect, but harder to execute. When emotion arises, you notice the impulse to detach, the automatic movement toward analysis, the familiar pathway. Feeling transforms into understanding, sensation becomes interpretation, and you're back in your head before the emotion fully registers. The practice. Name it. I'm detaching. Just that recognition interrupts the automaticity. Then ask, where is this feeling in my body? Not, what does this feeling mean? Or, why am I feeling this? But where? Tightness in your throat, pressure in your chest, heat in your belly, trembling in your hands. You're learning to be with emotion rather than immediately translating it, to feel feelings instead of understanding them. And over time, this creates new neural pathways, bottom-up processing that bypasses the cognitive defenses you've relied on for years, relational micro-practices. In conversation, you catch yourself analyzing the other person, tracking their patterns, formulating your response while they're still speaking. The familiar observer position, the practice. Notice when you're on the balcony. Literally ask yourself, am I watching this interaction or participating in it? Then stay connected a little longer than comfortable. Don't withdraw when the impulse arises. Don't retreat into analysis when vulnerability threatens. Just remain present, allowing yourself to be seen rather than only seeing. This isn't about forcing intimacy. It's about testing what happens when you don't automatically protect yourself through distance. Contemplative integration. Mindfulness practice can serve observers, but only if it doesn't create a new observer ego. Meditation teacher Michael Taft warns about this trap. The meditator who's learned how to undercut the sense of being the meditator versus the one who's simply reinforced the watching position with spiritual language. The difference? Decentering. Observing without identification, recognizing that the watcher itself is a function, not who you are. This is Jung's active imagination applied contemplatively, genuine dialogue with psychic contents rather than detached surveillance of them. You're not trying to transcend experience. You're learning to participate in it while maintaining awareness. The core fear work. The Enneagram identifies the observer's core fear, being overwhelmed, not having enough resources. The core longing, your needs are not a problem. The wounding message you internalized early. It's not okay to be comfortable in the world. These aren't just psychological insights, they're lived structures that organize your entire relational strategy. Working with them means recognizing when scarcity thinking drives your withdrawal, when the belief, "I don't have enough," causes you to contract, limit, hoard yourself. And then, this is the practice, trusting, just incrementally, that natural flow provides sufficiently, that you don't have to manage every expenditure of energy. That participation might not deplete you the way your nervous system insists it will. This is non-attachment in the genuine sense. Not spiritual bypassing, not detachment from life, but trust that you're resourced enough to risk being touched by what you encounter. These practices don't erase the observer function. They integrate it, unite it with what's been defended against. And over time, that integration reveals what wholeness actually looks like for consciousness that's learned to both watch and participate. Wholeness for the observer doesn't mean abandoning the capacity to see. It means holding both, observation and participation, distance and intimacy, the balcony and the dance floor, without one collapsing into the other. Integration looks like this. You can still perceive patterns others miss, track relational dynamics, notice the choreography beneath surface interaction. But now you're doing it from within relationship rather than from outside it. The perceptive distance remains functional. It no longer serves defense. You've married psychological objectivity to genuine encounter, deep seeing to embodied action, the wisdom that observes to the presence that participates. And what emerges is what Jung recognized as the transformation from private watching to transparent, morally engaged service. The defensive observer protects the self through distance. The integrated sage offers wisdom through presence, not commentary from safety, but guidance from lived experience. Not analysis that maintains separation, but insight that serves the larger whole. This is the movement Jung mapped, from unconscious identification with a single function to conscious relationship with the psyche's fuller totality. The observer who believed watching was consciousness discovers that consciousness can both observe and fully participate in what it's observing. That the watcher is not who you are, but what awareness can do. And when that recognition lands, when you realize the observational capacity is a function, not an identity, the staircase between balcony and dance floor becomes fluid. You can ascend when perspective serves, descend when presence is needed, move between stillness of contemplative insight and engagement of embodied life without losing yourself in either position. What does this feel like? Less like arrival, more like capacity. The ability to witness emotional intensity without immediately detaching, to participate in intimacy without losing the observational awareness that's genuinely you, to risk being seen while maintaining the perceptive clarity that allows you to see. You're no longer imprisoned by the watching position, but you haven't abandoned it either. You've integrated it. And integration, as Jung understood, doesn't erase difference. It creates relationship between what was split. This work requires confronting the core fear that participation will consume you, that you don't have resources to meet the world's demands, that descending from the balcony means losing the only position from which you've felt safe, the vulnerability of stepping onto the dance floor while the entire nervous system screams that withdrawal is survival. But here's what the integrated observer discovers. Participation doesn't deplete, it generates. Being touched by life doesn't destroy the self, it individuates it. And the psychic avarice that seemed like protection was actually what prevented you from accessing the vitality you were trying to conserve. Jung's vision of the self, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious integrated, can only know itself fully by participating in the world it observes. Consciousness doesn't achieve completion through perfect detachment. It achieves it through relationship, with the unconscious, with others, with life itself. The observer's gift is real. The capacity for deep seeing matters, but the invitation, always, perpetually, is to dance, not instead of watching. While watching. Both at once. the paradox that becomes possible only after you've risked what the defense was protecting. If you've recognized yourself in this pattern, you're not alone in this work. The consciousness that watches itself watching isn't pathology. It's one of the psyche's primary modes, and learning to integrate it, to unite observation with participation, wisdom with presence, is some of the most challenging individuation work you'll do. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. The observer's gift is perceptive clarity. The challenge is learning to offer that clarity while standing on the dance floor rather than watching from above. Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.